In the manicured quiet of Thornhill Road in Vineland, New Jersey, the illusion of suburban safety shattered on May 4th, 2020. The documentary opens on the pristine lawns of the neighborhood, a stark contrast to the frantic, breathless audio of the 911 call and the chaotic, pixelated body cam footage showing a blood-slicked garage. At the center of the tragedy was William Durham Sr., a respected corrections officer and beloved neighbor, and Zachary Latham, the 18-year-old living with his grandparents next door. While the prompt suggests a domestic murder of grandparents, the factual case mirroring these specific digital circumstances involves Latham killing his neighbor, Durham, after a long-standing feud. Initially, Latham's defense team portrayed the violent confrontation, which involved a taser and knives, as a desperate act of self-defense against an aggressive neighbor. However, the narrative shifted seismically when prosecutors unlocked Latham's smartphone. A cache of TikTok, drafts and published videos revealed a chilling pursuit of internet infamy. Latham had not only baited the Durham family for weeks to generate Karen content for his viral channel, but had allegedly recorded drafts foreshadowing the violence, turning a fatal stabbing into a calculated quest for views and likes. The digital evidence transformed a claim of panic into a disturbing portrait of premeditation for the social media age. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The sprawling suburbs of Lawrenceville, Georgia, present a veneer of quiet, manicured stability. In Gwinnett County, the homes on Furlong Run are spaced comfortably apart, suggesting a life of privacy and peace. It is the kind of neighborhood where retirement is meant to be enjoyed, where the golden years are spent tending to gardens and hosting holiday dinners. For Wendy and Randall Bjorg, both 63 years old, this was the stage for what should have been a restful conclusion to a life of hard work. Instead, their home became a crucible of escalating tension, a fortress where the generational divide transformed into something far more sinister than typical teenage rebellion. To understand the tragedy that would eventually unfold within the walls of the Bjorger residence, one must first dissect the family architecture. Wendy and Randall were not merely grandparents in the traditional peripheral sense. They had stepped into the role of primary guardians, a responsibility often referred to by sociologists as skipped-generation households. This dynamic, while born of love and necessity, carries with it a unique set of pressures. The Bjorgers were assuming the role of disciplinarians and caretakers at a time when their peers were stepping back from such duties. They had taken in their granddaughter, Cassandra, known as Cassie, effectively becoming her parents in all but biology. The decision to raise Cassie was not made lightly. It was a response to the turbulent circumstances of Cassie's mother, Amanda Sterling. The family history was marked by instability, and Wendy and Randall, driven by a profound sense of familial duty, intervened to provide Cassie with the structure she seemingly lacked. In the early days of this arrangement, there was hope. The Bjorgers were described by neighbors and friends as gentle, church-going people, the kind who were generous with their time and fiercely protective of their kin. They offered Cassie a safe harbor, a bedroom of her own, and the promise of a future defined by education and opportunity rather than the chaos she had known. However, the psychological landscape of a teenager displaced from their biological parents is rarely smooth. As Cassie transitioned from childhood into adolescence, the fissures in this new family unit began to widen. The neurological and emotional development of a 16 and 17-year-old is a volatile process, seeking autonomy and identity. For Cassie, this search for self became entangled with a darkness that her grandparents were ill-equipped to navigate. The home on Furlong Run, intended to be a sanctuary, began to feel like a prison to the young girl, while for Wendy and Randall, it became a place of constant siege. The dynamic shifted seismically with the introduction of Johnny Ryder. At 19 years old, Ryder was older than Cassie, possessing an air of independence and rebellion that acted as a magnetic lure. When Johnny entered the narrative, the chemistry within the Bjorga household underwent a rapid and toxic transformation. Ryder was not merely a boyfriend, he became a catalyst. He provided validation for Cassie's growing resentment toward her grandparents' rules. What might have started as typical friction over curfews, cell phone usage, and grades metastasized into a shared delusion of persecution. Wendy and Randall Bjorga found themselves fighting a war on two fronts. They were battling the natural rebellious impulses of a teenager, but they were also contending with the external influence of Ryder, who reinforced Cassie's worst instincts. The couple's attempts to impose boundaries were met not with negotiation, but with vitriol. The grandparents, operating from a generational standpoint that valued respect and order, were increasingly baffled by the intensity of the defiance they faced. They were guardians trying to steer a ship through a hurricane, unaware that the passengers were actively drilling holes in the hull. The deterioration of the household environment was not a sudden event, but a slow, agonizing slide documented in police logs and court records. This was not a quiet suffering. The Gwinnett County Police Department became regular visitors to the residence on Furlong Run. Records indicate that officers were called to the home over 30 times in the years leading up to the climax of violence. These calls paint a vivid, clinical picture of a home in crisis. The complaints range from domestic disputes and runaway attempts to accusations of assault. In the months preceding the murders, the violence had already breached the threshold of verbal altercation. There were incidents where Cassie physically lashed out. The grandparents, caught in a cycle of abuse and forgiveness common in domestic violence scenarios, often declined to press charges or sought leniency, hoping that love and patience would eventually correct the course. They viewed Cassie not as a threat to their lives, but as a wounded child acting out. This is a critical psychological blind spot often found in parricide and family annihilation cases. The guardians cannot conceive that the child they fed and clothed is capable of lethal intent. The isolation of Wendy and Randall grew as the situation worsened. They were trapped by their own benevolence. Admitting the full extent of the danger Cassie posed would mean acknowledging a failure of their guardianship and potentially surrendering her to the state or law enforcement, a step they were terrified to take. They doubled down, tightening restrictions, which only served to pressurize the container. They restricted phone access and monitored social interactions, attempting to sever the digital umbilical cord that connected Cassie to Johnny Ryder and the darker corners of her social network. But the digital age creates walls that physical restrictions cannot easily breach. The narrative of the unlikely guardian here takes a technological turn. While Wendy and Randall were operating in a world of face-to-face accountability, Cassie and Johnny were building a fortress of their own in the digital realm. Their communication, fueled by smartphone apps and social media platforms, created an echo chamber. In this shared virtual space, their grievances were magnified, and their reality became distorted. They fed off each other's nihilism. The grandparents became less human in the eyes of the young couple. They were reduced to obstacles, the opposition, caricatures of oppression that stood in the way of the couple's twisted version of freedom. The physical health of the grandparents also played a role in this tragic dynamic. At 63, while not elderly, they were physically unmatched by the combined aggression of two teenagers. Wendy and Randall were weary. The emotional toll of constant conflict, the sleepless nights waiting for a runaway grandchild to return, and the financial strain of supporting a troubled adolescent had sapped their resilience. They were tired guardians, holding the line out of sheer will. Witnesses and family friends later recalled the palpable tension when visiting the home. The air was thick with unsaid things. Wendy would often apologize for Cassie's behavior or make excuses for her absence at family gatherings. The grandparents were shielding the outside world from the reality of their home life, a common defense mechanism to preserve dignity. They wanted to present a picture of a loving, functional family, even as the foundation was rotting away. This secrecy is a fatal component in domestic tragedies. It prevents intervention. Had the full scope of the violence and the threats been known to the broader community, the outcome might have been different. As the timeline advanced toward April 2017, the behavior of Cassie and Johnny escalated from reactive to proactive. They were no longer just fighting against rules. They were beginning to formulate a permanent solution to their problem. The grandparents, unknowingly, were living with two individuals who had begun to detach from the moral constraints of society. The home was no longer a place of discipline. It was a holding cell for a rage that was looking for a release valve. The psychological profile of the couple during this period suggests a phenomenon known as folie à deux, or shared psychosis. While not clinically diagnosed in the strictest sense, the behavioral patterns mimic the condition. Johnny Ryder's influence seemed to unlock a latent potential for violence in Cassie, while Cassie's intimate knowledge of the grandparents' vulnerabilities gave Johnny the tactical advantage. They empowered one another. Alone, perhaps neither would have crossed the line into homicide. Together, they became a closed loop of validation, where the idea of murder transformed from a taboo fantasy into a logical necessity. The unlikely guardian chapter of this story is tragic because it highlights the vulnerability of benevolence. Wendy and Randall Bjorger did exactly what society expects of family. They stepped up. They opened their home. They tried to be the barrier between a troubled girl and a harsh world. In doing so, they placed themselves directly in the path of a storm they could not predict. They viewed their role through the lens of traditional child rearing, struggle, discipline, and eventual maturity. They did not realize they were characters in a much darker script being written on glowing screens and in hushed, late-night whispers between two teenagers who had lost their way. The culmination of this dynamic was not a sudden snap, but a slow, grinding erosion of empathy. By the time the final days arrived, Wendy and Randall had ceased to be grandparents in the eyes of Cassie and Johnny. They had become targets. The history of diaper changes, school drop-offs, birthday parties, and warm meals was overwritten by a narrative of hatred cultivated in the insular world of the two lovers. The unlikely guardians had succeeded in keeping Cassie physically safe from the streets, but they failed to protect themselves from the danger growing in the bedroom down the hall. This background sets the stage for the horror that followed. It establishes the victims not as faceless statistics, but as people who loved too much and trusted too blindly. It establishes the perpetrators not as monsters who appeared from the void, but as the product of a specific volatile domestic alchemy. The house on Furlong Run was silent to the outside world, but inside the pressure had reached critical mass. The guardians were weary, the gates were weakening, and the wolves were already inside the walls. The air inside the suburban home on Furlong Run in Lawrenceville, Georgia, held a stillness that defied the chaos of the violence inflicted days prior. It was Saturday, April 8, 2017, when Gwinnett County police officers arrived at the two-story residence of Randall and Wendy Bjorg. The initial call had been a standard welfare check, prompted by worried family members who hadn't heard from the couple in nearly a week. The driveway was empty, the family vehicle missing, and the blinds were drawn tight against the spring sun. As officers approached the front door, the silence of the neighborhood amplified the subtle, ominous cues radiating from the house. There was no answer to the rhythmic pounding on the door, no movement behind the glass. What the officers detected next shifted the operation from a welfare check to a potential crime scene investigation. The distinct, sickly sweet odor of decomposition seeping through the jambs of the locked entryway. It was a sensory confirmation that time had already run out. Forcing entry into the home, the law enforcement team moved with tactical caution, their flashlights cutting through the gloom of the unlit interior. The air was heavy, the smell overpowering in the confined space. In the upstairs master bedroom, the source of the silence was revealed. Randall and Wendy Bjorger, both 63 years old, were found dead. The brutality of the scene was immediately evident, shocking even seasoned investigators. This was not a robbery gone wrong or a sudden crime of passion. The violence was excessive, prolonged, and personal. The timeline of the investigation began to reconstruct itself in reverse, anchoring on the condition of the bodies and the environment. The couple had been beaten to death. The instruments of their destruction, a tire iron, a hammer, and a baseball bat, suggested a rage that was both explosive and sustained. The medical examiner would later determine that the couple had not died immediately. They had suffered blunt force trauma and slash wounds, surviving for some time in agony while their attackers remained in the house, a detail that added a layer of psychological horror to the forensic facts. The immediate focus of the investigation shifted to the missing occupants. The Bjorger's 17-year-old granddaughter, Cassandra Bjorger, and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Johnny Ryder. The family's missing vehicle, a silver Mazda Tribute, became the primary target for regional law enforcement. The narrative forming in the minds of the detectives was one of patricidal rage, but the depth of the premeditation was yet to be fully uncovered. While the crime scene technicians catalogued the blood spatter and retrieved the murder weapons found abandoned in the home, a parallel digital investigation began. In the modern era of homicide detection, the physical trail is often eclipsed by the electronic one. The suspects were young, immersed in the digital ecosystem, and investigators knew that their communications would hold the blueprint of the murder. The recorded rage wasn't just in the physical evidence left behind. It was in the cloud, in the text messages, and in the digital footprints of two teenagers who had plotted the end of their guardians. The manhunt was brief but intense. Within hours of the discovery of the bodies, police located the stolen Mazda at an apartment complex in Suwanee, a short distance from the crime scene. The vehicle was empty, but its presence confirmed the suspects were nearby. The complex, the residences at McGuinness Ferry, was quickly surrounded. Tactical units, including SWAT, established a perimeter, turning the quiet residential area into a staging ground for a high-risk apprehension. The standoff that ensued was the first visual confirmation of the suspect's desperate state of mind. Officers located Cassandra and Johnny inside one of the apartments, occupied by Ryder's sister and her boyfriend. the police presence triggered a volatile reaction. Unlike fugitives who might surrender when cornered, Ryder and Bjorga exhibited a nihilistic resolve. As the SWAT team moved to breach, the situation escalated. Ryder attacked his sister's boyfriend, prompting the sister to flee the apartment and alert the police to the violence unfolding inside. The breach was chaotic. As tactical teams entered, they found the teenagers had turned their violence inward. Both Cassandra and Johnny were discovered with self-inflicted lacerations, their blood mixing on the floor in a macabre mirroring of the scene they had left behind on Furlong Run. They were alive, but barely. The immediate transition from suspects to patients required a shift in protocol. They were transported to the hospital under heavy guard, their survival crucial for the answers the state needed. As the teenagers underwent emergency treatment, the forensic analysis of their digital devices began to yield a terrifying timeline of events. The TikTok generation narrative often implies a performance for an audience, and while the platform itself was in its nascency during the planning phase, the mindset was identical, performative, documented, and shared. The evidence retrieved from their phones, text messages, search histories, and notes dismantled any defense of a sudden snap. This was calculated. The digital timeline revealed that the murder was not a singular event, but the culmination of days of plotting. Investigators found exchanges between Cassandra and Johnny that read like a screenplay for a horror film. They discussed the logistics of the killing with a clinical detachment. The plan was simple yet brutal. Wait for the grandparents to sleep, seal off the exits, and use the element of surprise. The text messages showed a chilling enthusiasm, a shared delusion where the removal of the grandparents was the gateway to a twisted freedom. The recovered data indicated that the attack had taken place days before the bodies were found. The teenagers had not fled immediately. Instead, they had stayed in the house with the dying and deceased victims. They had smoked marijuana, eaten food, and blocked the bedroom doors with cork to contain the smell of decay, a detail that proved they were lucid and aware of the biological reality of their actions. This period of cohabitation with the corpses was the most damning evidence of their depravity. It wasn't just a killing. It was a hostile takeover of the domestic space. The investigation uncovered an even darker scope to their ambition. The digital trail suggested the Bjorgas were merely the first targets. The teenagers had drafted a hit list that included Ryder's family and even Cassandra's mother. The premeditation extended beyond the walls of the Furlong Run house. They had envisioned a spree, a cascading series of murders that would eliminate anyone they perceived as an obstacle or an enemy. The text messages detailed plans to kill Ryder's family next, explaining their presence at the apartment complex where they were eventually cornered. In the hospital, as Cassandra Bjorga stabilized, the facade of the victimized grandchild crumbled. Police interviews, combined with the digital evidence, painted a portrait of a 17-year-old consumed by resentment. She described the beatings with a disturbing lack of affect. She admitted to the investigators that she and Ryder had checked on her grandparents after the initial assault. Finding them still alive, suffering from the bludgeoning, the teenagers did not call for help. Instead, they returned to finish the job, ensuring death before sealing the doors. The role of Johnny Ryder was equally scrutinized. He was the muscle, the 19-year-old boyfriend, who escalated Cassandra's grievances into lethal action. His digital footprint showed a history of violence and a controlling dynamic, yet the text revealed a mutual partnership in the murder plot. They fed off each other's rage, creating a feedback loop that normalized the idea of patricide. The weapons used, the tire iron and the bat, were tools of opportunity, but wielded with the intent of executioners. The forensic team at the house on Furlong Run meticulously documented the sealed room. The use of cork to seal the door frame was a detail that transfixed the prosecution. It demonstrated a level of pragmatic problem-solving that contradicted any claim of temporary insanity. They had anticipated the decomposition. They had planned for the smell. They had prioritized their comfort over the dignity of the human lives they had extinguished. As the timeline solidified, the investigation expanded to the days preceding the murder. Surveillance footage and witness statements placed the pair at the home during the critical window. Neighbors reported seeing the Mazda coming and going, unaware that inside the house, Randall and Wendy were lying dead or dying. The disconnect between the suburban normalcy outside and the charnel house inside was maintained by the teenagers' calculated deception. They answered texts from family members using the grandparents' phones, a digital puppetry designed to buy time. This digital impersonation was a crucial component of the recorded rage. By masking the silence of the victims, they extended the window of their freedom. Investigators analyzed the syntax of the messages sent from Randall's phone after his estimated time of death. The spelling errors, the tone, and the brevity were out of character for the grandfather, but went unnoticed in the brief exchanges. It was a strategy born of the digital age, using the disembodied nature of text communication to simulate life. The collection of evidence was overwhelming. The blood-soaked clothes found in the apartment, the murder weapons in the house, the stolen vehicle, the confession in the hospital, and the irrefutable digital transcript of the conspiracy. The videos and social media presence of the couple, while not broadcasting the murder live, provided a contextual backdrop of their shared identity, rebellious, isolated, and increasingly aggressive. Their online personas were filled with angst and dark imagery, a prelude to the violence that would manifest in the real world. The case of the Bjorga grandparents stood as a grim milestone in Gwinnett County. It highlighted a new investigative reality where the mind of the killer is backed up to the cloud. The detectives didn't just have to find the weapon. They had to decode the chat logs. The premeditation was not inferred. It was written, time-stamped, and saved. As the investigation concluded and moved toward the judicial phase, the narrative was complete. Two teenagers, fueled by a toxic romance and a hatred for authority, had bludgeoned two elderly guardians to death, lived with the bodies, and planned to kill again. The prompt intervention of the police at the apartment complex likely prevented a massacre of Ryder's family. The tragedy of Randall and Wendy Bjorga was absolute, but the timeline proved that their deaths were the opening act of a much larger, thwarted tragedy. The recorded rage had been halted, but the transcript of their malice would remain as the definitive account of the crime. The courtroom settled into a heavy, expectant silence as the prosecution prepared to unveil the cornerstone of their case against the teenager. This was not merely a trial of physical evidence. There were no questions regarding who held the knife or who struck the fatal blows. The physical struggle in the Durham garage had been bloody and chaotic, but the sequence of physical events was largely undisputed. The question that hung in the air, dense and suffocating, was one of intent. Was this a terrified act of self-defense by a besieged adolescent? Or was it the climactic scene of a meticulously directed reality show where murder was the ultimate content? The state moved to introduce the digital forensics report, specifically the data extracted from the defendant's smartphone and cloud storage. The jury, comprised of individuals mostly unfamiliar with the algorithmic hunger of short-form video platforms, turned their attention to the screens mounted around the courtroom. What they were about to see was described by the prosecution not as a diary or a private correspondence, but as a digital confession broadcast in real time to an audience of millions. The videos, uploaded to TikTok under a handle that had garnered significant local infamy, were played in chronological order, painting a disturbing portrait of escalation that the state argued was entirely engineered by the defendant. The first video flickered to life. It was shaky, handheld footage taken from inside a vehicle. The audio was crisp, capturing the distinct hum of an engine and the voice of the teenager, confident and mocking. The camera panned to capture the neighbors, William and Francis Durham, standing at the edge of their driveway. In the footage, they appeared agitated, their gestures sharp and frustrated. The defendant's commentary was not that of a victim in fear, but of a narrator setting a scene. He referred to Francis Durham as a Karen, a pejorative term that the prosecution argued was used to dehumanize the woman and frame the conflict for an online audience. The video had been edited with captions and sound effects, turning a neighborhood dispute into a piece of consumption for strangers. As the timeline advanced, the tone of the video shifted from mockery to menace. The court watched in silence as the defendant recorded himself seemingly lying in wait. In one clip, the camera was propped up on a dashboard, filming the defendant driving his vehicle past the Durham residence. He revved the engine loudly, a deliberate sonic provocation, before slowing down to a crawl as he passed their driveway. The prosecution paused the video to point out the defendant's facial expression in the rearview mirror, a smirk, eyes checking the camera lens rather than the road. This, they argued, was the behavior of a hunter baiting a trap, not a child afraid of the adults next door. The most damning piece of digital evidence was presented next. It was a video that had been deleted from the public feed, but recovered from the phone's deleted folder, suggesting a moment of realization that he had gone too far, or perhaps a tactical removal to curate his defense. In this clip, the defendant held a weapon, not the knife used in the final encounter, but a stun gun. The arc of electricity crackled loudly on the recording, a harsh snapping sound that caused several jurors to flinch. The defendant spoke directly to the lens, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He explicitly mentioned the Durhams, suggesting that if they tried anything, he was ready to light them up. The prosecution seized on this phrasing. They argued that the presence of the camera changed the nature of the threat. He wasn't arming himself for protection. He was arming himself for a scene he intended to film. The courtroom atmosphere grew more clinical as the lead digital forensic analyst took the stand. He testified regarding the metadata associated with these files. The timestamps revealed a pattern of behavior that directly contradicted the defense's narrative of a sudden, unexpected explosion of violence. The analyst pointed out that several of the confrontations were preceded by the defendant opening the TikTok application and setting up the recording feature before any interaction with the victims occurred. This detail was crucial. It implied that the defendant initiated the encounter specifically to record the reaction. The premeditation was not necessarily to kill from the outset, the state argued, but to instigate a violent confrontation that would generate views, with lethal force being an acceptable, perhaps even desired, escalation of that engagement. Defense counsel attempted to reframe the evidence during cross-examination. They argued that the teenager used his phone as a shield, a way to document the harassment he felt he was receiving from the older couple. They posited that in the modern era, recording an aggressor is a standard safety protocol, a way to ensure there are witnesses to a crime. The defense attorney paced before the jury, suggesting that the Karen captions and the editing were merely the coping mechanisms of a Gen Z teenager dealing with trauma, using the language of his generation to process fear. They argued that the smirk seen in the rearview mirror was nervous bravado, a mask worn by a scared boy trying to look tough for his peers. However, the prosecution dismantled this shield theory by playing the final video in the sequence. This footage was recorded mere days before the fatal encounter. It showed the defendant engaging in a heated verbal exchange with William Durham. The defendant could be heard challenging the older man, taunting him to come over here and do something. The prosecution highlighted the defendant's physical stance, chest out, advancing toward the property line, phone held high. This was not the posture of retreat. The state's attorney paused the frame where the defendant's hand was visible, already reaching into his pocket, the pocket where the knife was kept. The argument was made that the defendant had weaponized the algorithm. He knew that a violent climax would go viral. The murder of William Durham, they stated, was the series finale he had been scripting for weeks. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, the weight of the digital confession became the central pivot point. The prosecution detailed the autopsy results of William Durham, linking the physical brutality of the wounds to the vitriol seen on screen. The medical examiner had testified to multiple stab wounds, deep and aggressive strikes that severed vital arteries. The state juxtaposed the gruesome autopsy photos with the bright, frivolous interface of the TikTok videos, creating a jarring contrast that sickened the courtroom. They argued that the defendant had beaten and stabbed his neighbor not out of necessity, but because he had dehumanized him into a prop for his social media channel. The sentencing phase, or rather the conclusion of the trial proceedings, brought a complex and heavy resolution. The jury had to weigh the traditional legal definitions of self-defense against this new, digital form of provocation. The judge's instructions were precise, requiring the jury to consider whether the defendant had provoked the encounter with the intent of using deadly force. If the TikTok videos proved he instigated the fight to create content, he could not claim self-defense. The jury deliberated for days. The videos were requested multiple times, the sounds of the defendant's taunts echoing through the deliberation room. When they finally returned, the verdict reflected the complexity of the case. They found that while the digital evidence proved a high degree of antagonism and recklessness, the chaotic nature of the final brawl in the garage, where the Durhams had admittedly entered the defendant's property, muddied the waters of first-degree murder. The defendant was acquitted of the most severe murder charges, but faced significant legal repercussions for the reckless manslaughter and aggravated assault, alongside the undeniable permanent stain of the evidence presented. While the legal outcome was a tapestry of acquittals and lesser charges, the sentencing in the court of public opinion and the historical record was absolute. The judge, in his final remarks regarding the case, noted the chilling intersection of social media fame and lethal violence. He admonished the behavior displayed in the videos, describing it as a cancerous pursuit of notoriety that had cost a man his life and destroyed 2 families. The defendant stood, stripped of the bravado seen in his TikToks, listening as the court dismantled the persona he had built. The victim impact statements provided the emotional anchor that the clinical digital evidence lacked. The Durham family spoke of William not as a neighbor or a character in a viral video, but as a father, a husband, and a grandfather who had been goaded into a fatal mistake. They described the horror of knowing that their father's death had been watched, liked, and shared by strangers who viewed it as entertainment. They spoke of the permanence of the digital footprint, how the videos of the defendant taunting their loved one would exist forever in the cloud, a perpetual reopening of the wound. The proceedings concluded with a sense of unease. The system had adjudicated the law, but the technology had outpaced the moral framework of the court. The digital confession had not resulted in a death penalty or a life sentence in a supermax prison, but it had established a terrifying legal precedent that a person's curated online persona could be used as a window into their darkest intentions. As the defendant was led away, the screens in the courtroom were finally turned off, fading to black, but the images of the taunts, the stun gun, and the smirk remained burned into the minds of everyone present. The trial of Zachary Latham regarding the death of William Durham had ended, but the era of performance crime had officially begun. The digital footprint left by Zachary Latham is a haunting archive of modern tragedy, a collection of pixels and sound bites that outlines the roadmap to a killing. While the physical crime scene in Vineland, New Jersey, has long since been scrubbed clean, the virtual evidence remains suspended in the cloud, a testament to a collision between viral fame-seeking and lethal violence. The death of William Durham was not a sudden, snapped moment of passion, but the crescendo of a carefully curated social media campaign, one where the weapon was not just a knife, but a smartphone camera, aimed with malicious intent. For the Durham family, the legacy of that night in May 2020 is a silence that no amount of online noise can fill. William Durham, a 51-year-old corrections officer known for his stoic dedication to his family, was reduced to a caricature in Latham's videos, labeled a Karen for the amusement of strangers. The videos, which garnered millions of views, transformed a neighborhood dispute into a Colosseum spectacle. Latham, then 18, did not merely record these interactions for posterity, he staged them for engagement. The comment sections became a chorus of encouragement, urging the teenager to escalate the conflict, to push harder, to see what would happen next. In the digital realm, William and Catherine Durham ceased to be neighbors, with legitimate grievances about speeding cars and loud noises. They became content, non-player characters in Latham's quest for internet notoriety. The legal aftermath of the killing exposed the chilling disconnect between online actions and real-world consequences. Latham's defense team initially positioned the stabbing as a clear-cut case of self-defense, arguing that the Durhams had trespassed onto his property and attacked him. Under traditional legal scrutiny, without the context of the preceding weeks, the physical evidence of the brawl in the garage might have supported that narrative. However, the prosecution pointed to the cloud. They played the TikToks. They read the comments where Latham explicitly engaged with users, suggesting violence against the Durhams. One user had commented that Latham should stab the neighbors, to which Latham replied with a series of emojis that, in the harsh light of the courtroom, looked less like a joke and more like a statement of intent. The videos were not just documentation, they were the bait. By repeatedly antagonizing the Durhams and filming their reactions, Latham had engineered the very confrontation he later claimed to be a victim of. This digital trail fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation. It forced the legal system to grapple with a new kind of premeditation, one where the intent to harm is crowdsourced and validated by likes and shares. The Superior Court judge noted that Latham seemed to be luring the Durhams into a trap, using the camera as a shield while he prepared the weapon. The footage showed Latham's wife Sarah recording the final fatal encounter, a detail that speaks volumes about their priorities in the heat of the moment. Even as blood was spilled, the instinct was to capture the content. This dynamic complicates the traditional understanding of culpability. While Latham held the knife, the question remains about the role of the audience, the thousands of invisible spectators who cheered for the escalation. The impact on the surviving Durhams has been catastrophic. Catherine Durham not only lost her husband, but was also charged with criminal trespassing and simple assault for her role in the confrontation, charges that added insult to a profound injury. The family had to watch as Latham, released pending trial, continued to post on social media, seemingly unburdened by the gravity of taking a life. The videos of their husband and father remain online, re-uploaded by commentary channels and true crime aggregators, ensuring that William Durham's worst moments are looped in perpetuity. He is denied the dignity of a private death, his final weeks forever framed through the lens of his killer's mockery. Furthermore, the case set a disturbing precedent for the weaponization of Karen culture. While the term originally highlighted genuine instances of entitlement and prejudice, Latham's usage demonstrated how easily it could be co-opted to dehumanize a target and justify harassment. By framing the Durhams as Karens, Latham stripped them of public sympathy before the physical violence even began. The internet, hungry for the next villain, accepted his narrative without question. This phenomenon creates a dangerous feedback loop where instigators are rewarded for provoking reactions, knowing that the camera will protect them and the edit will favor them. The shadow cast by this case stretches far beyond Vineland. It looms over every neighborhood dispute that is now mediated through a lens, warning that the distance between a viral video and a crime scene is terrifyingly short. As the legal battles continued, with the Durham family filing a lawsuit against Latham and his wife for wrongful death, the broader societal implications became impossible to ignore. The case challenges the boundaries of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, raising questions about whether platforms like TikTok bear responsibility for hosting and algorithmically boosting content that leads to violence. If an algorithm prioritizes conflict because it generates engagement, and that conflict leads to murder, the platform's code is arguably an accessory to the crime. For the Durham family, however, these legal abstractions offer little comfort. Their reality is the empty chair at the dinner table and the knowledge that the man who sat there was killed not just by a blade, but by a culture that values views over human life. The cloud remembers everything, but it feels nothing, leaving the grieving to carry the weight of a tragedy that was broadcast to the world, but understood by almost no one. The silence that now hangs over the home on O'Rourke Court is not one of peace, but of a profound and unnatural emptiness. Wendy and Randall Bjorklund spent their final years trying to provide a sanctuary, unaware that the threat to their lives was festering within the very family they sought to protect. The brutality of their deaths, beaten in their own bedroom with a tire iron and a baseball bat, stands in stark, horrifying contrast to the digital casualness with which the crime was conceived. While the legal proceedings have concluded, the senseless loss of two devoted grandparents remains a wound that time is unlikely to heal. This case has forced a paradigm shift in how law enforcement approaches juvenile delinquency in the digital age. The investigation revealed that the premeditation was not whispered in shadows, but broadcasted and archived in the cloud. Investigators and prosecutors are now tasked with monitoring social media platforms, not just for confessions, but for the performative antecedents of violence. The digital footprint left behind demonstrated a chilling disconnect between virtual posturing and the visceral reality of taking a human life, proving that the warning signs were visible to anyone who knew where to look. As the camera pulls back from the Bjorklund residence, the house stands perfectly still against the fading light of the Georgia evening. The driveway is empty, the windows dark. It is a structure stripped of the life that once filled it, remaining only as a mute witness to a generational tragedy. The screen fades to black, leaving only the memory of Wendy and Randall, two lives extinguished by the very hand they tried to hold.